Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Space Wars, 5G Satellites in Space, another in our continuing series of online events designed to help you learn more about wireless technology and its impacts on people and the environment. I'm Doug Wood. I'm the founder and director of Americans for Responsible Technology and 5G Crisis, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for your work as we build public opinion to push back against the deployment of 5G and other wireless technologies. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to watch a presentation about 5G satellites in space organized by our friends at 5G Free California. And I must say, I was blown away by what I saw. And since then, I've learned a lot more about this very disturbing situation. And I realize that more people need to know about what's going on in our world. And so here we are tonight. In the next 2 hours, we'll hear from 4 outstanding individuals, each of whom brings a slightly different perspective to this issue. I've asked them to give us some basic information about the current situation, how these satellites work, what kinds of issues they raise, how they may affect us and the environment, and of course, what we can do about it. Each speaker is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have an open discussion in which I will pose some of your questions to the panelists. So we have a lot to get to tonight. I think it's going to be a really exciting night, frightening in some respects, disturbing in many respects, but also hopeful. And for those of you who may have to leave early, if you do, I just want you to know that there is some hope coming your way in this program, so don't despair. And with that, I'm going to turn to our first presenter, Ben Levi. Ben is an engineer by training. He's had a 35-year career in computer consulting, specializing in Macintosh computer platforms, consulting with hundreds of clients worldwide in all aspects of Apple hardware, software, training, systems design, networking, and relational database development. Ben's various projects have focused on facilitating conscious evolution in people and in organizations, and include supporting many face-to-face and web-based conferences with a range of his skills and his ability. We're very, very pleased to have Ben with us. Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Doug, and welcome everybody. It's really an honor to be here to present to you all. I've been asked to introduce the 5G satellite issue, so I'm going to spend about 15 minutes doing that, and then they'll be followed by a few other people, and then we'll have a bunch of questions. So do be holding your questions until the end because you may get them answered. So here's a quick history of Earth satellites. The first Soviet Union launched the first satellite in 1957, and since then, there have been 8,400 satellites launched to date. And right now, there's about 5,000 satellites in orbit right now, but 3,000 of them are operational and, of course, growing as SpaceX launches more and more satellites every month. So what there is there's a network called the U.S. Space Surveillance Network that tries to track by radar all of the objects that are greater than 4 inches in diameter, and they've got over 13,000 of them that they're tracking, which is really nice that they're doing that for everybody, but there's actually tens of thousands more that are that size that they're not able to track. So there's a lot of stuff up there already, and of course there's going to be a lot more as more and more satellites are launched. And of course, when you look at all the objects that are smaller than 4 inches, so there's 4 inches. So you could imagine how much damage something 3 inches can do, right? They don't even track those. They can't even track them that small. So there's potentially, a disaster waiting to happen up there. Then there's something called the Kessler syndrome, which some of you probably have heard of, and that's this theoretical scenario where there's a cascading collision of one satellite, which creates more debris, which crashes into other satellites, creating more debris, and it basically would render a whole orbit to be inoperable for literally generations until all the debris eventually falls into the atmosphere, which eventually it will, and burn up. And of course, there's the issue of all that stuff in the atmosphere and what it might be doing to us as well. So what companies are actually planning this non-geostationary orbit satellites, constellations? And of course, SpaceX is right up there at the top. They've had approval from the FCC for 12,000 satellites over a period of 15 years, and they've applied for 30,000 more. And the key is that every year they're going to be having some of those satellites drop into orbit or into the atmosphere and burn up. And so they have to continually keep launching new satellites every year, which is why they need to apply for so many more. OneWeb, which is just came out of bankruptcy recently, has applied for 48,000. I think that's, I'm not sure whether that's more vaporware or not, but that's what they've applied for anyway. Amazon has its Kuiper project, which has 3,236 that are authorized at about, relatively very low Earth orbit, 366 to 391. Interestingly enough, one you probably haven't heard of, but Samsung is planning 4,600 satellites orbiting at 900 miles up. And then there's a number of ones that are already up there. Kepler, Telesat, Russia has its own. China is starting to launch its own. And then there's also a current sat phone system that utilizes the Iridium system that's been around since 1998. So some of you might even be watching this from a satellite internet connection. If you don't have access to any other way of getting broadband internet, then satellite is really what you have. And what SpaceX and others are doing are basically providing the next generation of these satellites, which are going to be faster and lower latency. So on the left is a picture simulation of what the Starlink network is going to look like when it's fully mobilized on Earth. And as you can see, there isn't going to be a place on Earth except for the poles that is going to be not subject to this satellite radiation of some kind. And then on the right is a simulation of space debris from the ESA website, which attempts to track this kind of thing. And it just gives you a sense, obviously this isn't to scale. One of those pixels floating around is far, far, far bigger than the average satellite or even 1,000 satellites. But you get the idea of all this stuff that's out there circling the Earth at any given time. There's an example of astronomical interference. We've been hearing about it, but now there are pictures out that show what it is. This is a photo, a composite photo taken on July 21st over a 30-second period of about 30 Starlink satellites and the Neowise comet. So again, this is a composite. If there's a time-lapse movie, there's a link to here and in a Google Doc, which we'll put in the chat later on, where you can see the actual video taken of these satellites streaming by. But this is what the astronomers have to deal with on a regular basis with these satellites. And this is just a small amount of the satellites that are going to be launched. So let's just focus on the Starlink constellation, because that's the one we know most about. They're actually up there and they're orbiting the Earth right now. And the purpose is basically to provide faster satellite internet to the premises, to a building, to a home, to an office that cannot get internet through any other means, either through wireless or through fiber or copper. And it promises to be much higher speeds and much lower latency because the elevation of these satellites are so much lower than the current ones, which are at geosynchronous orbit of 23,000 miles above the Earth. And the body of people that are interested in this is rather significant. About 10% of the US population, 34 million people, are without access to fast internet. So this is one of the reasons why they decided to do this, is because there's a market for it. Estimated cost is $10 billion over 10 years. There's already approved 12,000 satellites, as I was saying, and SpaceX has applied for 30,000 more. And right now that application is sitting with the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, which is kind of the overall responsibility for the whole planet to monitor what kind of satellites are and how many are floating around. SpaceX first launched its prototypes in 2018. The first 60 were launched just in May of last year. And as of about a week ago, there were 595 total in orbit. They've initially designed, I learn something new every day when I'm in this work, and I only thought that they were going to have 4,400 satellites when they were fully operational, and this is the Starlink network. Well, I found out that that's incorrect. In response to concerns about space debris, SpaceX requested lowering the orbits of its satellites to 550 kilometers or lower, very low orbit. And because of that, they're generating a second generation satellite constellation, which is an additional 7,500 satellites. So just SpaceX alone is planning to have about 12,000 satellites in orbit when it's fully deployed in a few years. And just as a context, that's 20 times the current number of SpaceX satellites currently in orbit. And these satellites are going to talk to each other via laser because they can be able to see each other in orbit, so they're going to be line of sight. And then they're going to use about 3 or 4 bands of 5G frequencies from 10 gigahertz all the way up to like 40 gigahertz to communicate with Earth. And the Earth stations are going to be these user terminals and also these big gateway stations, which are these large buildings with a whole bunch of dishes that are going to connect to the fiber optic terrestrial network. And this is, SpaceX originally asked for 1 million Earth stations, and they just recently, about a week ago, asked the FCC for permission to have 4 million more because they say that there's such a high demand. So they're going to be putting out about 5 million of these CP terminals, user terminals, and I think I've got a picture of it. So on the right is what a terminal is going to look like. It's going to mount on your roof. There's already a beta testing open. If you can go to starlink.com and stick in your email address. The coverage is going to be northern United States, southern Canada, and right now it covers Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Maine, and some upper portions of some of the lower states below that. You have to have a clear view of the northern sky, and the package includes one of these terminal dishes, a Wi-Fi router, and a power supply. And basically, Musk says you just plug it in, aim it toward the north. It's going to have a couple motors that will align it with certain satellite orbitals. And then you basically sign a confidentiality agreement. They don't guarantee a connection in the beta test, but there's a huge demand. As I was saying, they've already got over 700,000 people wanting to sign up for it. So here's a few links that I find very handy to have around. They're also going to be in the Google Doc where you can access them easily. The first is called CelesteTrack. It lets you visualize all the satellites in orbit. You can search for certain constellations, and you can even adjust it so that you can watch them orbiting. It's got a time adjustable feature on it where you can see them quickly orbit or slow orbit, and it's quite an amazing site to have happen. There's a great site that it's called See a Satellite Tonight. If you put in your address, it will show you where to look in the sky and at what time and what satellites to view. Quite an extraordinary little feat there, totally free, of course. The best ones, by the way, if you ever want to look at that, are the ones where you've got 20 or 30 of them at one time because they do go by relatively quickly. There's an excellent YouTube I just found called What SpaceX is Doing About Starlink Space Debris. I recommend that if you're interested in that. The link to the distribution of space debris around the Earth, that animated GIF that I showed you, there's a link to that in there. And then I also just want to invite you to consider if you want to support what it is that we're doing, and we'll talk about that later on in the webinar. We have something called the Healthy Heavens Trust Initiative, and there's a link to that too. And with that, my presentation is over, and I'll stop my share. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. Really a terrific overview, and I appreciate that. Our next speaker and presenter is Mr. Joseph Sandri. He is the founder and CEO of Thought Delivery Systems. He's been an executive officer with multiple publicly traded corporations. Most recently, he was co-president of Fiber Tower Corporation, and before that, president of IDT Spectrum. He serves on several boards in the technology and public service sectors. Prior to his executive experience, Joe was an attorney in private practice in Washington, D.C., representing numerous Fortune 100 companies in telecommunications matters. He has training and experience in communications law, journalism, radio frequency engineering. He's a member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, and a longstanding board member of the National Spectrum Management Association, and he serves on the board of the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive. Please join me in welcoming Joe Sandri.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ben. So today I was asked to talk a little bit more about understanding satellite networks and their impacts. And I'm going to burn through a few slides rather quickly and then slow down on a few others, but happy to circle back to some later if that is useful to folks. And Ben did a great job outlining a lot of the satellite mega constellations that are either in the air, being launched, or proposed, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But what I wanted to do is bring some attention to the actual types of orbits. So there's something called HEOs, MEOs, and LEOs. High Earth orbiting, medium Earth orbiting, and low Earth orbiting. And Ben touched a little bit on that. The lunar orbit, you'll see to your right. That's where the moon is. And then a high Earth orbiting satellite around 30, 40,000 kilometers is where a large percentage of the satellite networks that folks are familiar with operate, as well as some MEOs, somewhere between below 30-some thousand to about 2,000 kilometers. And a lot of those systems include the systems that we all rely on every day, the systems that work the timing in our telecommunications networks, the systems that follow and direct missiles for national defense systems, and systems that operate our mapping, Google Maps, Waze, things like that. Those are, most of them are tied to GPS, and the United States for years was the only country that managed the GPS systems that the world used. That has changed. In June, the Chinese launched a system, the final parts of a system called Beidao, which not only serves their commercial interests, but also the People's Liberation Army of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Later this year, the European Union will finish launching a system called Galileo, which is also a GPS system. So there's competition. A lot of these countries or areas no longer rely upon only the United States, and therefore there will be a whole variety of other aspects to that. The other thing is I wanted you to be aware of is when you look closely at the Leo orbit, that's the one closest to the Earth. That's where SpaceX and Kuiper and Amazon and OneWeb and all these mega constellations want to launch. They're going to be tightly wrapped right close to the Earth. It's cheaper to launch closer to the Earth. It's better communication connectivity. There's a lot of reasons for it, but it also is going to bring us to a point where there's an intense amount of congestion. We're already there. I'm going to move through some other slides which talk about different structures of not all satellites orbit in a clean circle. They're elliptical. They have all kinds of variety of other orbital inclinations. They view the Earth. Some of them are geostationary. They stay right above your house or your city, and they don't move. They rotate with the Earth at almost 20,000 miles per hour. Others move independently of the Earth. In terms of launching strategies, the boom in launching is occurring because it's becoming much more cheaper per kilogram to launch equipment into space. That's a key reason. Elon Musk, who's a multi-billionaire, has lucrative contracts with the US government, and there's a variety of other entities out there in Russia and China, and even in the US and in the UK, who are also launching or have plans to launch. Ben discussed space debris. I won't go through that too much, but except to note that in terms of the impact on life forms, I want to get to that shortly and make you aware of some unstudied or understudied aspects which I view to be irresponsibly missed in the rush to space. You can see here the movement from Sputnik. By the way, Sputnik was like 58 centimeters in diameter. It was a tiny little satellite launched in 1957. The ones launched today are often much larger. And while there will be a move for microsatellites and what are called CubeSats, and that move's underway, the density is not decreasing. It's increasing at an exponential rate. And you can see this, as Ben noted, this is not to scale. It's to scale in one sense, in that when the light reflects off of this, or when an infrared astronomer, who's using an infrared type of telescope, they see a huge impact, and it can blind all kinds of sensitive equipment. There's an organization called the International Telecommunications Union, or EUTE. It used to be called the International Telegraph Union, and it was the first international organization that really has endured to this day, because countries needed to coordinate when they brought telegraph lines across borders. That subsequently morphed into the Telecommunications Union for radio and television, and now for satellite and other wireless networks. In fact, the United Nations is based on that structure. The EUTE, or ITU, is based in Geneva, Switzerland. I've spent many years either as a U.S. government delegate or as a corporate delegate attending those negotiations, and there's a whole bunch of aspects to how the law works there. There's also something called space law. I studied in the 1980s under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Swetchie of the U.S. Air Force, who was an expert in space law, and there's a variety of aspects to that we could talk about. And then, of course, in basic telecommunications law, where the FCC or other organizations, federal organizations for different countries, have a say in the launching or the taking down of satellites. So in terms of who's opposed or who's with certain satellite networks, there's a variety of folks who are either opposed to satellite night sky pollution, like this famous or newly famous photographer, Casenberry, who's been featured in some national and international articles. He's the photographer of the comet Neowise, which comes around every 6,000 years. He went to make his photographs, and they were all streaked because the Starlink network was destroying his photographs. So the quiet enjoyment to the night skies was dramatically altered. Of course, Elon Musk and a lot of the CEOs are moving ahead with licensing and launching, and it's a grab, like a land grab, like the Oklahoma land rush, because it's easy for them to get licenses. It's easy for them to launch enormous numbers of satellites, and there's no actual process that is slowing it down to take the federal agencies of expertise in the areas of, let's say, night sky. The FCC is not, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States is not a night sky expert. It has not gone to and gotten detailed peer-reviewed studies from the other federal agencies of expertise in those areas, as well as Fish and Game and Wildlife and others. I'll talk in a moment about the impacts on nature. But here's a list of some folks and their positions regarding the satellite networks. Of course, if you want to see the constellations from Earth using your naked eye, or using a telescope or an infrared system, that is already impacted, and it's going to get worse until we have a concentrated gravity of folks together pushing on all their public representatives and in the courts. Here I'm on as Doug mentioned, one of my organizations that I'm on the board of directors of the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive. We find the oldest and largest trees on planet Earth, and we get legal rights to take cuttings and to save them. We archive them and we reforest with them. We did a recent reforesting at the Presidio in California of some of the largest trees, not only ones that currently exist, but some that were chopped down over 100 years ago, and we found living DNA in their stumps. As part of that, I spent a lot of time looking at the electrical aspects of living things, including trees. Every living thing, as a matter of biology 101, is an electrical unit. You and me are. We all operate on spectrum channels, as do trees, and your newborn child or the plant out your window or your pet. Trees have long been known, although it's well misunderstood or not understood by the general public, that they follow what's called projective geometry and precise 14-day solar system cycles. This was first pioneered by a scientist, Edward Lawrence. You could read his book, The Vortex of Life, Nature's Patterns in Space and Time. Now, I have yet to see any evidence that any of these very sensitive aspects of nature have been studied, and the impact of these very sensitive aspects of nature have been studied with the launch of these satellites that are tightly concentrically circled around close to Earth. Again, we don't even know what the radio frequency exposure limit is for flowers or trees or people. We don't know what spectrum bands a white oak operates on, or a bush, or you. These are irresponsibly understudied, and the irresponsible lack of curiosity by our federal agencies in these matters is something of deep concern. And again, I'm somebody, I sold licenses to AT&T that had my name on them that are operating 5G, and I've sold or been involved with either opposing or studying satellite networks for a few decades. And I'm deeply concerned at this point in time that we are not studying the impacts and the teledensity of the networks that are being deployed for good reasons. The other aspect of this is we do need internet capabilities for people. We don't want to deny them for people just based on their location on the planet, but we do need to have a much, much more effectively studied understanding of what the impacts are. This is ready, fire, aim right now. It's not ready, aim, fire. In terms of catastrophic problems, satellites networks are not, according to the evidence I've been able to locate, and no government agency has been able to show us, they're not insured against harmful impacts to human beings through radio frequency exposure or certain other impacts. And they're not insured, as far as I'm aware, against catastrophic failure. Catastrophic failures can occur through geomagnetic storms, what's called a coronal mass injection or a solar flare. In 1859, a massive solar flare hit planet Earth. It set telegraph lines on fire. Paper on telegraph operators' desks burst into flame. Networks went down. There was a miss by many miles of a solar flare a decade or so ago, and it took out networks throughout North America, even though it didn't even hit planet Earth. So what does it mean if there's another solar flare? It hits our satellite systems, and we rely on them so tightly for our national defense, for our mapping, for our entire economy. And people are driving, and a variety of other aspects. So these are things I think the public needs to see some information about. Other things that can occur, there's known gravity disturbances over Australia and other countries right now. There's a variety of man-made phenomena. What if by mistake or on purpose due to war making or terrorism, missiles or satellite-based attacks, whether they're direct nuclear weapons or electromagnetic pulse weapons that derive from nuclear weapons, which can mimic a solar flare, conventional explosives, shrapnel, lasers can take out satellites, microwave, directed microwave systems, and limpet type mines, which would attach to a satellite, can take out satellites. There can be ground control sabotage, where through cyber or other methods, the systems by which satellites are controlled could be disrupted. And just bad designs, bad control systems, and other systemic failures. There is a lot of language in the trade journals that is pointing to that some of the satellite systems already deployed may not be performing as advertised. They may not be as maneuverable as we were told. They may not be as camouflage as we were told. In fact, we're well aware that some of the SpaceX systems are too bright, and so they started painting them. But then the dark paint attracted heat from the sun, and that can fry electronics, and that heat also burns up infrared astronomy equipment in terms of being able to get a usable image. And there's a variety of other concerns. So I just wanted to share a lot of that. This shows, there's all kinds of anti-aircraft systems out there. So why are we relying on these systems so heavily, and why are we not studying them more carefully before we become reliant on them? And of course, why aren't we asking all our federal agencies of expertise to provide comprehensive studies that are subject to public notice and comment? And we should, either through the Balance Group or some of our sister organizations, we should start building a much larger group of concerned citizens to advocate on all these areas, is my opinion. This is the type of signage, by the way, that for electromagnetic field harm that the FCC and other countries can require. There's other types of signage. We have yet to hear a comprehensive understanding from the large mega constellations that are being proposed, what they mean in terms of, are they studying cumulative effects, both from their base stations, there are millions of base stations, like Ben mentioned, that they want to deploy on the ground, which would be no different in terms of location than your routers or cellular base stations, as well as the RF interference coming from the increasing constellation of satellites in space. A group that Ben and Julian and I have joined, called the Balance Group, has filed a series of oppositions to SpaceX and has made other filings, and there's some links here for your enjoyment and study. And with that, I'll turn back to Doug.
Thank you, Joe. As I said before, a little frightening and disturbing, but thank you for that so much. I want to welcome Arthur Firstenberg to our meeting tonight. Arthur is, I think many of you know Arthur. He is the founder and president of the Cellular Phone Task Force and the author of that great book, The Invisible Rainbow, A History of Electricity and Life. He's also the author of Microwaving Our Planet, The Environmental Impact of the Wireless Revolution. Since 1996, the Cellular Phone Task Force has provided a global clearinghouse for information about wireless technology's injurious effects and created a national support network for people disabled by this technology. In 1997, the task force was the lead litigant in a challenge brought by over 50 citizens groups against the FCC's limit for human exposure to radio frequency radiation. Arthur is also the president of the Santa Fe Alliance for Public Health and Safety, which he co-founded in 2005, and which mounted a successful campaign to oppose citywide Wi-Fi in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is the president of New Mexicans for Utility Safety, which he co-founded in 2015, which succeeded in stopping the deployment of smart meters in New Mexico cities. Arthur, just a great, great accomplishment. He's also founded the Global Union Against Radiation Deployment from Space, and its acronym is GUARDS, in 2014 to oppose global wireless internet from thousands of satellites in space. He was ahead of his time back then. And I'm very, very pleased that Arthur can join us this evening by telephone from his home in New Mexico. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Arthur Firstenberg. Arthur, are you with us?
We live today in an increasingly imaginary world. Inside of our computer screens, frozen in time, the buffalo roam and the deer and the antelope play. The air is so pure and the zephyrs so free, and blackbirds call so loud and sweet from every greenwood tree. But out in the real world, blackbirds are falling dead from the sky. Fish are choking on plastic and dying from lack of oxygen. The air smells bad and the land is ugly. In order to keep sane, we take refuge in the screens of our devices, where the world is still full of pretend vitality. But it is our devices that have destroyed the vitality of the real world. Instead of birds, we have antennas. We cannot have both. Instead of butterflies, we have mobile phones. We cannot have both. Instead of forests, we have the internet. We cannot have both. Instead of stars, we have satellites. Instead of good health, we have cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. 15 minutes is not enough time for me to paint a picture of everything the satellites are doing to life on this green earth, of how rocket exhaust is destroying ozone and altering the climate, of how dead satellites and fragments of collided satellites have turned outer space into the world's largest garbage pit, of how worn-out satellites, soon by the hundreds and thousands, will be deorbited to burn up in the atmosphere to turn into toxic dust and toxic smoke. The emergency, which is looming on the horizon in the next month, is the radiation. But it will do no good to talk about the radiation from satellites while ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the 8 billion mobile phones that are sterilizing this planet all by themselves, with or without the satellites, and that are creating the demand for connectivity at all times and in all places. Elon Musk is merely doing what everyone wants him to do. Yes, the satellites will destroy all life on this planet very quickly. They are located in the ionosphere, which is the Earth's source of high voltage. It is the Earth's power plant. The ionosphere generates and controls the global electric circuit, which is an electrical current that travels from sky to Earth at all times and circulates within the bodies of all living creatures. It is an electrical current that gives us life, that gives us the energy for growth and healing. The satellites of SpaceX will very shortly pollute this living circuit with billions of electronic frequencies. Yes, the satellites will kill us, but the satellites are only one end of a machine. At the other end are everyone's mobile phones. The problem for those who use them is not how much or how little you use your phone. The problem is that you own one at all, that you expect it to work, however frequently or however rarely, anywhere you happen to be. That is the problem that Elon Musk and Adrian Steckel and all the CEOs of all the other satellite companies are addressing. They are putting the satellites in low orbits in the ionosphere in order to provide very short latencies for everyone's mobile phones, everywhere on Earth. The only way to stop this machine would be a mass movement to throw away our mobile phones and never use them again. It is the only way to save this planet. People have become so used to carrying and using their mobile devices that they forget that these devices, even without any of the satellites and without any of the cell towers, are themselves very powerful sources of radiation, powerful enough to travel 20 miles to the nearest tower or 20,000 miles to a satellite in space. People are holding these killing devices in their hands, living with these devices in their homes, and making no connection to the massive pandemics of cancer, diabetes, and heart disease that are sickening them and their children and everyone they know. I am constantly being asked for a different solution. Some people are offering fiber optic cables as a safe substitute for towers and satellites, as if they served the same purpose. They don't. People who get fiber to their homes still want to be able to send texts, talk to their friends and family and colleagues, and get on the internet when they are outdoors and in their cars and everywhere else. And what people also don't realize is that fiber optic cables are the backbone, or what they call the backhaul, for 5G. Fiber optics is the backhaul on the ground, and satellites will be the backhaul in space. A 2017 study by the consulting firm Deloitte estimated that wireless companies needed to lay $20 billion worth of new fiber in the United States in order to stick antennas into it to broadcast 5G. Telus, a company that is building 5G in Canada, has spent $1 billion laying fiber optic cable just in Vancouver in order to broadcast 5G in that city. All other wireless companies are doing the same thing everywhere on Earth. If you advocate for fiber optics, you are advocating for 5G. Some people are advocating for Li-Fi, or modulated light, as a safe way to have wireless in your home or business. It is not. There is no such thing as safe wireless. It is an oxymoron. a contradiction in terms. Putting all the information-carrying frequencies on rays of light instead of beams of microwaves does not make those frequencies less damaging. Light is a necessary nutrient. We absorb it through our skin and through our eyes. Polluting it with pulsating frequencies will be more damaging, not less, than using microwaves. I became an activist in 1995 because Sarah Benson wrote to me from Australia to tell me that Bill Gates and Craig McCaw were planning to put 800 satellites into space for an internet in the sky, and that we must organize to stop it. In 1997, in the second edition of my book titled Microwaving Our Planet, The Environmental Impact of the Wireless Revolution, I wrote the following, quote, "The proliferation of satellites we are about to witness, unless this world wakes up soon, is mind-boggling, and nobody seems to have considered that popping thousands of them up there like so much confetti might have consequences for our atmosphere and our climate. And there will be thousands. Orbcom plans a fleet of 28, of which several are already in orbit. Motorola plans one fleet of 72 called Iridium at an altitude of 485 miles, of which the first 5 were launched on May 5th, 1997. Another fleet of 72 called M-Star, which will fly 350 miles higher. A third fleet of 70 satellites that will fly 65 miles higher still. Odyssey's fleet of 12, Ellipso's 17, Globalstar's 56, and Skybridge's 64 are not far behind. Neither is Teledesic, the brainchild of Bill Gates and Craig McCaw, billed as a kind of sky-based wireless multimedia internet. This fleet of over 300 satellites is being built by the Boeing company and already has Federal Communications Commission approval. It will orbit 435 miles above us. There are also dozens, perhaps hundreds of small companies founded by small private entrepreneurs who are already sending up fleets of smaller, cheaper satellites that we never hear about. NASA facilities in California and Florida have been converted into private spaceports. Launch facilities are being built in Alaska, New Mexico, and Virginia by companies hoping to provide space data showing where the potholes are and whether buses are on schedule, to build systems that find hikers lost in the wilderness and oil tankers on the high seas. All of this hardware is considered disposable and will need replacements every 5 years, so there will be a steady stream of hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites launched every year for the foreseeable future, starting now." End quote. I wrote about microwave radiation, ozone destruction of the Van Allen belts, acid rain and massive water pollution near launch sites, and hundreds of toxic chemicals that are used in the manufacture of satellites, and the vandalism of our night sky. Most of those plans did not happen in 1997 because not enough people were on the internet yet to make them profitable. Wi-Fi had not been invented yet. Not enough people had cell phones yet. So the demand was not there. Bill Gates' constellation of 800 satellites was scaled back to 300 and then scrapped. But it is happening today on an unimaginable scale. When Iridium's 66 satellites were turned on September 23, 1998, people all over the earth reported headaches, dizziness, nausea, insomnia, nosebleeds, heart palpitations, asthma attacks, ringing in the ears, and other effects of radiation sickness that began on that morning exactly. Mortality rates in the United States rose by 4 to 5% for 2 weeks. Birds were not flying in the sky. Homing pigeons got lost by the thousands and never returned home. When Iridium resumed service on March 30th, 2001, after emerging from bankruptcy, it caused nausea, flu-like symptoms, and feelings of oppression. And there was an epidemic of spontaneous abortions and deaths of newborn foals among very expensive racehorses in many countries. When Iridium added data and internet to its voice services on June 5th, 2001, again came reports of flu-like symptoms, nausea, and also hoarseness from far and wide. When Globalstar, the second satellite phone constellation, went into service on Monday, February 28, 2000, widespread reports of nausea, headaches, leg pain, respiratory problems, depression, and lack of energy began on Friday, February 25th, the previous business day. For 20 years, our skies have not changed much. So far, only Iridium and Globalstar have low-orbit satellites that are providing cell phone service. But during the last 20 years, most people on Earth have acquired one or more mobile phones, and the demand for service is now insatiable. SpaceX, OneWeb, Amazon, Facebook, Canada's Telesat, and Kepler, Russia's Roscosmos, the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, and other companies are responding to consumer demand. That demand must end, or we will shortly not have a planet to live on. During 2020, SpaceX has been launching 60 satellites at a time, twice a month. On April 22nd, when another launch of 60 satellites brought the number of SpaceX's satellites up to 420, enough to provide service to the high mid-latitudes, SpaceX began testing its satellites in a small way. And people in many parts of the world began to have heart palpitations on April 22nd exactly, and they have had them ever since. Iridium operates 66 satellites. SpaceX is planning to eventually have 42,000 satellites in orbit, not just 12,000. It plans to begin beta testing with customers in the northern United States and southern Canada in September with the first 800 satellites. We have a radiation emergency in the sky. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Wise words and a lot to think about. Let me introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Julian Gresser, for those of you who do not know. Julian sent me a bio, which I'm happy to read to you. Julian Gresser is of counsel at Swanken & Turner and co-founder of the Balance Group. He's an international and environmental attorney, professional negotiator, inventor, and recognized expert on East Asia. He is currently of counsel, as I said, with the Washington law firm of Swanken & Turner, which is a Washington-based legal consulting technology group dedicated to helping all sides in the 5G satellite controversy, trying to discover a path that is safe, secure, environmentally conscious, and protective of national security. Mr. Gresser has developed an innovative MCLE course, The Art of Human-Centered Lawyering, that addresses the dilemma attorneys face in balancing personal integrity and happiness with the stresses and practical necessities of legal practice. He is the CEO of Big Heart Technologies, a humanitarian benefit corporation founded to provide tools and resources to empower collaborative innovation and negotiation training. He has served as legal advisor to numerous European, Japanese, and US companies on a wide array of business issues, including joint ventures, limited partnerships, technology licensing, export controls, and customs fraud, antitrust, and intellectual property protection, particularly patent infringement disputes. Julian Gresser has twice been the visiting Mitsubishi Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School and a visiting professor at MIT and at Beijing University. He's been senior consultant to the US State Department, the World Bank, the Prime Minister's Office of Japan, the People's Republic of China, and on it goes. It's an honor for me to introduce you to Julian Gresser, one of the best people that I know in the world. Julian, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. So, okay, great. I just want to, and I didn't arrange this, but I've been having some sort of episode with my eye, and everything is broken up into a prism. And since part of the, this, as I say, I didn't arrange this, it's just that I'm having some sort of episode with my eye, and yet the key message of what I'm trying to convey is there's no need to panic in light of what this whole satellite program. So I'm going to try to walk my talk, as they say, and handle whatever is happening to my eye, even as I present this material as succinctly as I can. So let's begin. And if for some reason I can't see, you'll have to excuse me, but I think I'm okay. This has happened to me once before, where I just sort of see a prism and I can't see directly. So anyway, that's what's happening with me at this very moment. So let's begin. we're at a historic, I believe, heroic moment. And the first and most basic question I will ask is, when and how will we awake from the consensus trance I believe we're in? Consensus trance comes out of the anthropological literature, best illustrated when Captain Cook sailed his boat into Botany Bay, and the local indigenous people there didn't see a huge man of war anchored right in the harbor. They went about their evening meals and so forth. How come? It was so outside their experience, they failed to see it. They had a negative hallucination. However, when he put down a rowboat, they had canoes and they could relate to it. I submit this is what is happening with this phenomenon that Ben and Joe have introduced, that engages the entire world, and most of the world is utterly unaware of it. The consensus trance says it can't be happening, so you buy into my version of blindness, and we collectively don't see that which is actually happening before our eyes. The most important point, I believe, to bring across tonight is that timing is critical. What is at stake? It's hard to believe that the FCC, and particularly 5 FC commissioners, may be strongly influencing, if not determining, the fate of the Earth. As Joe said, their mode of operation is ready, fire, aim. There's little, if any, enforcement going on of the regulations that they do have with respect to satellites. It really mirrors what's happening and how they're approaching the whole 5G dilemma at the national and at the local levels. The stakes could not be higher. What I want to suggest from my contribution tonight is a very practical mode of action by which we can address these problems. We, in the United States, in collaboration with groups and concerned citizens, organizations around the world, enlisting the support of their governments as well. Okay. Now, Joe just touched on some of the concerns. This is a chart that Ben prepared, but it shows the array of problems. And I can't list and take your time tonight to go over all of them, only to say we have very serious unassessed health effects, both not only from the radiation of this clusters of satellites, but particularly these huge base stations and then the millions of Earth stations. There are significant environmental effects, bird migration, bee colony collapses, insect decimation, all coming out of this profound insight that Joe suggested, that all living creatures are essentially transceivers. There are privacy effects, because we're really creating a wireless global satellite-based infrastructure, which raises issues of personal privacy as well as government surveillance on a global level. There are issues of collisions, of debris, which will, as Joe and Ben have suggested, could have cascading catastrophic effects. There are issues of interference with scientific research, with weather prediction, and astronomical inquiry. So this is a profound array of potential. The key word is unaddressed, largely unaddressed and unassessed harms, all of which, of these potential harms, can connect with one another. So you can think there is an aggregate, cumulative, negative, synergistic possibility here, which neither the FCC, these 5 commissioners, or anybody has really looked at. And yet, as you've seen tonight, this program is rapidly moving forward at an increasingly accelerating pace. Now, it's important, lawyers, of which I am one, are interested in economics. At some law schools, we get training in economics. And here I want to give you in just 2 minutes the economics of the present situation in a nutshell. The point of departure for this discussion is the 1972 OECD polluter pays principle, which basically is a sound welfare economics that the cost of industrial commercial activities that is externalized to the public should, from a rational economic system, be internalized to the company. They should take account of it and make rational decisions, which under the economic model will benefit all of society. What is happening here in the satellite and the 5G area is the opposite of it. Instead of the polluter pays principle, we have the public pays principle. So what does that mean? Particularly in the satellite area, the satellite companies are asking for massive direct subsidies from taxpayers. Your dollars are going to pay Elon Musk and OneWeb, in case the British government, for the benefit of their shareholders. Now, clearly, they're arguing this is of great public benefit, but it's important to understand direct subsidies as well as ratepayer of subsidies. These 2 points have been brought out in the regulators, the FCC case, a very important landmark decision. The third way in which the industry is being subsidized is through regulation. This is not generally understood by non-economists, but basically allowing permissive non-regulation is a subsidy, which is exactly what's happening on terrestrially and particularly in the satellite program, because these costs, the industry, the companies are not being asked to absorb any of these costs. And there's no victim compensation system as there is for toxic torts with a Superfund and so forth. It's all on the public. And as Joe very importantly said, there's no system indemnification, there's no insurance. What company launches a product without any insurance? Can you imagine? Okay, so what we put together is a very practical, on-the-ground laser strategy, which we believe can affect a shift, a rebalancing of what's going on that will offer hope. So as any case in controversy, you have to begin with what is the other side's position? The FCC's position and claim is that it has regulatory authority and is for the space program. As best we can understand, it's predicated on a provision in the Telecommunications Act, 1996, which suggests that it has control over the provision of satellite-based services. The provision of a service, and it's predicated on the FCC's control over the frequencies. It's important to understand this in terms of as we are developing this legal case. The FCC defines its mandate, which really many of the government agencies do, is to support industry, the telecom industry. There's nothing sort of intrinsically evil about that. It's just how they define their mission. Now, what we're doing in this Healthy Heavens Trust, we are required, I should say, by administrative law in the United States. You can't just sort of soar into a court. You have to be able to show a record in which you presented your concerns to the agency, listen to their response, and if it is not adequate, then you have to go, you can use that as a basis to then bring a judicial action. So what we are saying, I think very succinctly is, look, the FCC must follow established international and federal and state laws and procedures. It's not as though that we're operating in a legal no man's land. There is a body, a very substantial body of international convention, of treaties that relate to outer space, that relate to the law of the sea, that relate to international environmental concerns, that relate to privacy. It's as though none of this matters in terms of where we are now. So that is the basic point. Moreover, there's a body of federal law, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as other laws. And that this is our fundamental position. Now, there are other stakeholders, we'll explore in a second, who also have concerns and can weigh in. And the important point here is to not view the situation as though we're all facing a monolith. The federal government is not monolithic. As Joe suggested, there are many agencies who have deep concerns about their jurisdictions and missions being encroached upon, and the strategy I will lay out for you will address that. Okay, so what we're going to do, and in the process now, and we're quite well along, is to prepare what is called a petition for expedited rulemaking. And I come back to the keyword expedited. We're going to draw up the fundamental challenge we're going to present to the FCC and these 5 commissioners is to lay out the international legal regime that has already been established. I mean, Joe discussed and others about collisions, about debris. I mean, who's liable for that? Who's going to be responsible for that? It's not as though nobody's addressed that issue, but very peculiarly, I mean, I must say, it's almost something out of Alice in Wonderland. The FCC has taken the position under the Liability Convention that the United States will not be responsible for the damage and collisions that is being permitted because the FCC is not a statutory agency. It's a regulatory agency. So what they're basically saying is that we don't have jurisdiction. We don't have the power. We're just a regulator. We don't have congressional authority, and yet they're doing it. This is a very casuistic position. Anyway, under the US federal laws, we have some very good precedent pioneered by NRDC and the famous United Kitowa Band of Cherokee Indian case. And most recently, all the basic argument has been well argued by the Environmental Health Trust and Children's Health Defense in its recent filing with the FCC, which applies even more powerfully in the satellite area. We're basically saying the entire program is a major federal action, that the Administrative Procedure Act requires a thorough assessment not only of the risks of this major federal action, but also a really diligent exploration of alternatives, which we'll come to shortly. The last point is this issue of national security. And this is one of the key points that I think has not been missed. Because beyond this being a health issue and environmental issue, under the Secure 5G and Beyond Act of 2020, which President Trump signed on March 23rd, the United States government is aware of the vulnerability of a wireless-based satellite infrastructure. And this act has mandates the federal government, led by the FCC, to look at the vulnerability and to provide the president with an assessment of the risks within 180 days. Now we're getting near that, and we don't see any evidence of a deep, thoughtful exploration, nor an active engagement of the public, which is clearly stated in the law. The important point I want to bring out is that this is not just simply a matter of national US security. And as was well explained in my colleague Tim Shockley's declaration in our challenge in March to the approval of 1 million Earth stations to SpaceX, he points out that a wireless-based satellite infrastructure is extremely dangerous and vulnerable to attack. And Joe hinted on some of the aspects. Either by intent or by natural consequence, it's vulnerable. And this is not only a matter of US national security, but international security, because the risks, as we've laid out in that diagram, apply to every country on this earth. And other national laws have a lot to say about this argument. For example, in Italy, if you deprive the night sky of its dark brilliance, this is a violation of the Italian law against light pollution. Similarly in Spain, similarly in other countries. We're not just talking about violations of US law, we're talking about the actions of 5 commissioners whose consequences will raise serious legal questions in 50, 100 other countries around the world. Now, in addition to the legal aspects, we believe there's a better process by which the FCC can go about doing this. And we are developing a kind of an innovation to bring all the federal governments together to engage the international decision-making organizations. Joe mentioned the International Telecommunications Union, and many others, are UN agencies, through a set of interrogatories that focus on each one of these agencies' deep concerns to help them understand and awaken them out of this consensus trance that their jurisdictions and missions are gravely affected. Take the Department of Agriculture. Suppose U.S. agriculture becomes endangered. Shouldn't the Department of Agriculture have a say at the launch and deployment of these satellites? Okay, so we are going to engage through our very focused petition, which becomes a very powerful statement, all these other key decision makers at the international level, at the national level, and to encourage the US government to open an intergovernmental consultative process with other governments, which they haven't done to date. Now, an important point as I start to reach my conclusion is under the National Environmental Policy Act and the APA, as well as under international law, you can read these conventions as part of a protection of the public trust in the heavens, the mandate to approach this sacred trust in a disciplined, thoughtful way. You can read a strong responsibility for the United States as a fiduciary to examine viable alternatives. Viable alternatives. None of this has been done. It's as though the only thing that matters is the agenda of the satellite companies. In point of fact, there is a viable alternative. This is the main point I want to bring out. The viable alternative has been suggested by others already today is the existing terrestrial optical fiber infrastructure. And what has not been understood is that there are over 750,000 miles of already installed optical fiber ocean infrastructure, which constitutes actually the backbone of our present internet. It comes out of the sea. Now, this technology dating 20, 30 years ago is even into the 19th century when the first cable was laid down, is stable, it's proven, it's less risky, it's energy efficient. So as opposed to the opposite of what is the satellite technology that Elon Musk and the others are promoting. No doubt this is an engineering genius that they have in mind, but it's unstable, it's unproven. Ben mentioned OneWeb collapsed in bankruptcy, just came out of it. It's less risky and it's very risky and it's energy inefficient. Now there is one issue that I think has to be addressed head on, and that is the digital divide. As Ben pointed out, there is a strong and very legitimate public policy issue nationally and internationally that some people do not have access to the internet. And this is, you could say, it has almost become, with the importance of the internet, a fundamental right. And so one can understand that part of the motivation for the satellite. The problem is, the problem with it, for the reasons I've explained, is it's highly risky, and there's a better, immediately available, efficient alternative, and that is hardwired optical fiber. Now, I know Arthur has some concerns about optical fiber, and Ben suggests, okay, copper wire is fine, and we can deliver the internet through cable telephone poles in most of the country and throughout the poor countries of the world. Now, you could say, all right, well, some communities still can't get it. It's too expensive, even though, as I've suggested, there's a massive subsidy that's being asked for this 5G wireless and satellite thing. But there is a lot of research going on now of safer wireless. So there are some communities that just have to have wireless. Let's give them at least safer wireless with full disclosure and the key word of informed consent. Because who are we to say if some families want to accept the risks, informed about the consent, it's their decision ultimately. And finally, to have ongoing international subsidized research for safe solutions, such as DARPA itself is already, we're well aware, coming up with. Okay. So here's a pathway toward an effective solution. The FCC itself has confessed that it doesn't have expertise in these areas. Okay, fair enough. That chart that you remember, environmental harms, health risks, even privacy issues, maybe there's some on that, but all collisions in space and all of this, they don't have the expertise. Okay, it's not a grievous fault, they don't have it. But what we're proposing as part of the petition for rulemaking is we've already well along the way to create in what we call the 5G International Legal Action Network, a brain trust of some of the brightest lawyers, scientists, engineers, economists, so forth, all over the world. And we will provide them as part of our petition for rulemaking and our interrogatories. We can provide the FCC and other parts of the federal government with a template, and we will actually write the key, let's call it the key elements of the rulemaking that we are asking them to adapt. And our fundamental request is that there be a pause, a moratorium. That's what we will be requesting, and we believe that we will get an expedited review by the federal courts because of the national security risks of what is going on. If the FCC said, no, we're going to go on business as usual, then we will point out the palpable and immediate risks to national and international security, and we will go to the federal court, the DC Circuit, and see, following the Kinawito and other cases, that they will remand it, and we will then work with the FCC to adopt the rules and rulemaking that we will propose and co-create with the private sector and with the other elements of the federal government. So last slide. How to support this legal action? Well, the first is I've given you our basic agenda. We've raised $30,000. We need $100,000 to be able to prosecute this, not just simply to prepare and file the thing, but also this coordination. And of course, and then we want to take this expedited appeal to the federal court. We believe, and this is really important, the time is of the essence. It's not generally understood by people around the world that they have a right to participate in federal and judicial actions in the United States if they are aggrieved, if they are harmed. But there is this issue of standing. There is this issue of coming in early. You cannot, it becomes increasingly difficult if astronomers from Italy, for example, do not express their concerns early on at the administrative level to just sort of show up when this is in the federal courts. So we urge those who are concerned about what they've heard tonight to work with us, to join the Healthy Heavens Trust Initiative or other organizations. Let's put together a new collaborative enterprise, and we have a very sharp focus point and by which to then affect beneficial change. I refer you to our website. And the final point is to let's together restore wisdom, heart, and balance. That's what's been missing. And through this process, we're going to have monthly 5G Elon briefings. So everybody who's interested in this issue can see very specifically the progress that we're making to try to affect this rebalancing, which is really the essential problem and the essential challenge. Thank you very much for your interest this evening, and I really look forward to a dialogue together.